Good afternoon and welcome to today's seminar, which is a collaborative effort between the President's Lecture Series and the Philosophy Forum of the University of Montana. I'm pinch hitting today for Albert Borgman, who customarily provides the introductions for these seminars. Our guest today is Michael. I should introduce myself, I guess. I'm Richard Drake. I teach in the history department here. Our guest today is Michael Scheuer. He worked for 22 years for the CIA. A good portion of that time was spent as the chief of the Bin Laden issue station. I think I have that right. And the Osama Bin Laden tracking unit. He is one of the supreme authorities in the Western world on Al-Qaeda, and we're very delighted to have him here today, part of our series. He's written 3 books. The first of them, which he wrote anonymously in 2002, Through Our Enemy's Eyes, Osama Bin Laden, Radical Islam and the Future of America, if I'm not mistaken. That came out in an expanded edition in 2006, did it not? The second book was Imperial Hubris, Why the West is Losing the War on Terror. And this book appeared in 2004. It became a New York Times bestseller, and a very prophetic book indeed, particularly the sections dealing with the war in Afghanistan. Some of his most grim predictions in that 2004 book are coming to pass now. Finally, he wrote Marching Toward Hell, America and Islam After Iraq. This book appeared in 2008, and it will be the subject of his town gown lecture tonight at 8 o'clock in the University Center ballroom. Get there early because we expect quite a crowd there tonight. Today he's going to talk with us about his education as a CIA agent and the threat of Islamist militancy that we're facing now. So please join me in welcoming Michael Scheuer.
Thank you for coming, everybody. If you come again tonight, Montanans will certainly have a reputation as gluttons for punishment. I thought I would take a couple minutes and just talk a little bit about how, at least in my experience, CIA works and doesn't work, I guess. First of all, I always like to say, people seem to think that if you worked for the CIA and you no longer work for them and you're out talking, that you're going to be bashing the CIA. And I'm not one of those fellas. The CIA to me was the greatest place to work, at least that I could imagine. And I hated leaving it. I wish I was still there. But I left not for anything to do with the agency, but I thought that the 9/11 Commission had been a disastrous kind of whitewash for America. Being unable to find anyone responsible for anything before 9/11 was, to me, a bridge too far. After all the deliberations and all the testimony, they found out that the intelligence community was misstructured, that the plumbing chart was wrong, and that's why things didn't work. Well, that's not the case. So I resigned to talk about that a little bit. I've had very little traction, but I thought it was the right thing to do at the time, and I still think it is. One thing I'd always like to say about the agency is that if anything, the idea that it is a rogue organization is certainly off the mark, at least since the middle 70s, since the Church Commission. We are peculiarly the instrument of the President of the United States. We do what the President says and can do very little without his direct authorization. And so if you want to change the CIA, in many ways, you have to change the president. And we've done that. We'll see how things go. The agency is above all a service organization. We don't make policy. We follow it even when it's stupid or ill-informed or simply ignorant. I think if the American people knew what was done before 9/11, what was done before the invasion of Iraq to convince people that it wasn't a good idea to do, that they would have a bit more respect for the agency as an organization. Our failure, I think, before 9/11 was our inability to come before the American people and say we did everything possible to stop that attack. I personally don't think surprise attacks can be stopped with very much frequency, but we could have done far more both to kill the enemy and to disrupt his activities, but we didn't do that primarily because I believe of senior leadership failures under both parties. If you have, I don't want to stand here and give you war stories, so if you have questions about the agency, when we go to questions and answers, I'd be happy to answer them to the extent that I can. On the subject of Islamic militancy, and I'll make the point more explicitly tonight, I think. The war we're fighting at the moment is a war that we have to fight only to the extent we want to. We are not the main enemy in this war. We are not even Al-Qaeda, bin Laden, and the rest of them really don't want to fight us any longer than they have to. They have decided through their own deliberations that their major enemies, the Saudis, the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Algerians, and the Israelis, are able to survive because of American military support, funding, diplomatic support, military protection. And to the extent they can knock us out of the Middle East to the greatest degree possible, they are convinced, and whether it turns out to be true or not is another question, that they can take on the rest of those entities and defeat them. So we are not, as I said, we're not the main enemy. Their main goal is simply to get us out of the way so they can go after the enemies that are more dangerous to them. We are entirely fighting an enemy that doesn't exist, thanks to the ideologies or the political expediency of our leaders in both parties. We're not at war because people hate our liberties or our elections or gender equality or primaries in Iowa. If we were being attacked for those things, at most the enemy would be a lethal nuisance that we could squash sometimes, he'd hurt us sometimes, but would not be a national security threat. We are involved in this war because of what we do overseas, what our government does overseas, and not at all because of who we are. I would think people would step back once in a while and think about why would Muslims try to move their families to the United States so frequently and immigrate here if they thought our society was vile and evil. We have spent now, well, bin Laden declared war on us in '96. He didn't think we heard him, so he did it again in '98. And throughout the corpus of his rhetoric, which is substantial now, there is almost no mention of any of those things that Mr. Bush, Mr. Clinton, or Senator Obama over the endless campaign talked about. There's no mention of a desire to destroy our primaries. There's no mention of a desire to destroy our liberties. There's an overwhelmingly candid discussion of our support for Israel, of our support for the tyrannies that govern places like Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Jordan. A very frank discussion of our presence, civilian and military, on the Arabian Peninsula. Our support for countries which are deemed widely in the Muslim world to oppress Muslims, especially India and Russia and China. Those are the things that this war is made out of. And none of us have to accept the indictment that those are anti-Muslim policies, but I think we do have to accept that perception is reality. And there's a book by John Esposito who I disagree with on many things. I think he soft pedals the ideal, the components of jihad ideology. But they did a 7-year study based on Gallup polling that showed that 80% of the Muslim world shared a belief with al-Qaeda that our foreign policies, especially the ones enumerated by bin Laden, amounted to an attack on the Islamic faith and on the followers of Islam. Not nearly 80% or anywhere near a fraction of that is willing to yet pick up an AK-47 or to kill himself. But the bulk of that opinion certainly provides significant support for people who are willing to pick up weapons. And while we don't have to agree with their perception of our foreign policy, we do have to accept that very often in this world, perception is reality. And until we accept that, until we can say to the American people, they're not trying to make my daughters wear burqas when they go to Catholic school in the fall. We're going to be fighting an enemy that doesn't exist and an enemy that will bleed us in terms of lives and treasure and in domestic political unity. I guess I would close my opening comments by simply saying we seem to have an inability to figure out what our war aims are in this particular war. Are we going to build a democracy? Are we going to give Afghan women the rights of American women? Are we going to militarily defeat the enemy? On the enemy side, on the Islamist side, their method, their metric for deciding how well they're doing against the United States is encapsulated in 3 brief phrases. First, bleed us to bankruptcy. Second, to spread our military and intelligence forces to the point where we have no flexibility and no reserves. And third, to try to instigate, as Ho Chi Minh and the North Vietnamese did, as much political disunity at home as they can. And I would leave it to you, but from my perspective, I think there's very little reason for al-Qaeda and its allies to be disappointed in the progress they've made since 1996 in their war against us. So I would leave it there and invite questions or comments or criticisms. Sir.
A couple of quick questions. What should we think of the argument that bin Laden is not alive? And what do you think the cost of the war is, taking into account future foreseeable costs, has been so far?
I think there's every reason to believe that bin Laden is alive. We have now 12, 13 years of tracking al-Qaeda, and they have lost innumerable numbers of leaders, important leaders, and they have never once tried to keep it a secret. More often than not, they announce it because they are both grieving and celebrating. The person we killed has embraced what they think is martyrdom and has gone, with God's permission, to paradise. And so they are involved both in grieving and celebrating. I'll give you a good example. When they were getting their clock cleaned in the fall of 2001 in Afghanistan, we killed their military commander, a guy named Mohammed Atef. In the midst of this turmoil, they went on the internet, announced his death, announced his successor, and published the successor's curriculum vitae to show that they had someone who was militarily competent to take the place. I think in some ways to try to hide the death of Osama bin Laden would be somewhat similar to trying to hide the death of the President of the United States. I think it would be a very difficult thing to do. But I think intrinsically they are not prone to do that kind of thing. I also think that we've been sold a bill of goods on dialysis, kidney problem. He's been drinking Afghan water for 25 years. It seems to me if he had a kidney problem, it would have caught up with him by now. In terms of cost, I am not at all, sir, an economist. They say it's cost $1 trillion in Iraq so far. The cost of Afghanistan has been less, but it's going to go up. But I don't know how they're going to figure in the costs. What's the cost of driving so many junior field grade officers out of the military because of the way the wars have been conducted? What's the cost of ruining so much military equipment because of overuse? What's the cost in the families of young men and women who have been on their third or fourth tour in Afghanistan? I think the costs are going to be very much more than just monetary, sir. What's the cost in the trust of the American people toward their government? Sir.
Yeah, I just had a comment about how's that balanced against the cost of the embassy bombings in Africa and the other terrorist attacks that have occurred against American interests since the 1980s all the way up to the now, including how that affects those families, civilians.
Absolutely a good question. I think the question is better framed than why hasn't your government done anything to stop those since pick a date. Why was there not an effective response against the East Africa bombings? Why was there not any response after the Cole? Why was there no response to 2 attacks against the United States and Saudi Arabia in 95 and 96? Why was there no response against the attacks against American troops in Yemen and Somalia in 92, 93, and 94? The only mercy in any war, I think, is speed and getting it over as quickly as possible. Clearly, the American government does not care about protecting Americans. Over the course of my career, what I noticed after Mr. Reagan is with each administration, there was less and less putting Americans' safety as a priority. I'll give you, I think, the most dramatic example I know of, and it might not be dramatic to you, but it's dramatic to me because I worked it. From 1987, when I started to work on Afghanistan, and I think it began in 1982, the United States government every year put together a survey of terrorist training camps around the world. Not just Muslim, Islamist training camps, but Japanese Red Army, the secular Palestinians, the Communist People's Party in the Philippines. So at the end of every year, it's kind of flipped to say it, but we had a yearbook. In each camp was sketched out. If we had overhead imagery of it, we had overhead imagery in the book. We had how many people were trained, what the training regimens were, who was funding it, how many people went through in a course, how many courses a year. So now at the agency there is, if it began in 82, there are now 27 volumes of this. The only terrorism training camps that have ever been attacked anywhere in the world are in Afghanistan. Why hasn't your government moved ahead to do that? I'm sorry?
Didn't Reagan hit a bunch of camps in Libya in response?
He hit something in Libya. Yes, that's correct. I forgot. That's the one exception.
I just want to make sure.
Yes, sir. That's correct. But the great bulk, whether it's Somalia, Sudan, Yemen, Mindanao, the great bulk of camps that were training people to kill Americans have never been bothered. Even in the Great War on Terror, we've never hit the camps of Hezbollah that are training people in the Bekaa Valley regularly. We always have reasons not to. At least in the case of the CIA, the question is always asked, what if you do it and it fails and the Washington Post or the New York Times laughs at you? Or the Europeans get mad at you? Very seldom is the question asked, what happens if we don't do it? How many Americans die if we don't kill bin Laden in 96? If we don't destroy the Hezbollah training camps before they do X? So I'm not one that thinks that protecting Americans in the broad sense is a very high priority for any American politician. If it was, we wouldn't be doing the things we were, and we'd be doing some things we aren't doing. Sir.
I have two quick questions. The first is, what should our mission be in Afghanistan, according to you? And the second is, what are our options in Pakistan? as that increasingly tends towards the control of the Islamic extremists, such as we've seen in the area of SWAT recently?
Yeah, I would answer that the first question simply on the basis of history. We have about 2,500 years of the historical record of people invading Afghanistan. The only things that have ever worked were a punitive expedition by the British in the 1880s and Alexander the Great's decision to move Greeks out and colonize parts of Afghanistan in the 3rd century before Christ. Now, I don't think there's many unemployed Americans who want to move to Afghanistan and settle, and it's too late to do a punitive expedition. So I think at the end of the day, the war in Afghanistan is over. What is truly tragic in the last week is that no American general resigned and told the president that if you're going to send 17,000 troops, you may as well not send any, sir, because it's a drop in a bottomless bucket. The only mission we really had in Afghanistan that was accomplishable was to lay waste to as much of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda as we could and get out. We went, we came, we saw, and we got stuck. We took the cities and thought we won. The cities always fall. And now we're faced with an insurgency that probably has more fighters in the field than we do. I think President Obama will have in the next year, maybe less, a decision about whether we lose Afghanistan or lose Afghanistan and Pakistan. And I think the decision can only be to cut the Afghans loose. Pakistan, to me, is a good example of the inability of American leaders to escape the Cold War. 9/11 was an attack, an act of war against the United States. It was not an attack on Western civilization. And instead of going and taking care of the problem ourselves, we defaulted to the Cold War. We looked for other people to do our dirty work for us. First, like, I don't know how many fathers or mothers here have teenage daughters, but when you take your teenage daughter to dinner with some of her friends, none of them can go to the bathroom by themselves. They have to go in a group. And that's the way America conducts wars now. We get attacked, but we can't go until the Romanians sign up and the South Koreans sign up. And so by the time we're ready to go, it's too late. And we also have a bunch of allies who don't fight. And so from that perspective, we waited too long. We didn't take the opportunity we had to exert savagery. In terms of Pakistan, we tried to get them to do our dirty work. I think we forget that on the 10th of September, 2001, Al-Qaeda and the Taliban had no bones to pick with the Pakistanis. To the extent that Pakistan is becoming a failed state, there are only two causes. First, we pushed them to do what we wouldn't do ourselves for ourselves. And second, we insisted on the return of democracy. We've basically destroyed the Pakistani political system. So that's kind of where I come down on it. I think if we can save either one, and I think it's questionable that we can do even Pakistan, we certainly have to opt for doing all we can in Pakistan, hope for the generals to take over again, and then support them to the extent that they can stabilize the country. But the days that they're going to help us against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda are long gone, sir. We're going to be very soon in Afghanistan the last man standing. Sir.
Mr. Scheuer, I really enjoyed very much your book.
Thank you, sir.
I found kind of a schizo in my reading of it. You provide such a wonderful argument for understanding who the enemy is in this particular area. And the reasons, the keeping the resource oil prices low, the support for military regimes, oppressive regimes, restrictions on the practice of the Islamic faith. And I can really understand that because my first response on 9/11 was to read about the situation, to learn who these people are, what are they doing, what do they want. So I understood where you come from. But then the second part of it Killing in large numbers is not enough to defeat our Muslim foes. With killing must come a Sherman-like raising of infrastructure, roads and irrigation systems, bridges, power plants and crops material, blah, 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 many civilian casualties. That's against the law. I understand
If it is, then the law should be changed.
as a CIA agent, I understand you're telling truth to the executive branch so that they can make good policy. As a citizen, you say, I mean, it seems to me you create such a great argument that we should change some of our policies in the Middle East so that to kind of diffuse this outrage at certain things that are happening in our name and with our billions of dollars. So I'm just curious as to whether, I'd like to see the first, your observations on the first half of the book, our policy and the changes that you might see that we might make.
Well, the dichotomy there, I hope, is less than it seems. My argument basically comes down to, because we will not consider changing policies, we are rapidly becoming a big Israel. And all we have left to defend ourselves with is the intelligence and the military services, which are not enough. But if that's all you have, then the option you have to take is the one you just read from the book. You have to do whatever it takes to destroy the enemy. Well, you know, we always go to extremes here. What type of war are we fighting? We're fighting an insurgency. And insurgents don't wear uniforms. They live amongst civilians who support them either because they've been intimidated or more likely because they support them. So you have a couple of options. Afghanistan or any other Islamist insurgency we run into. Iraq is going to be the same way if we leave. You have a couple of options. You either don't go, or you go and do your business there as savagely as it needs to be done, and then you get out right away. Or you pick the worst of both worlds and do what we're doing now. Don't use enough military force and try to install a very foreign system of government and a secular system.
But we're assuming the policy doesn't change.
Policy hasn't changed in 35 years, sir.
That's the underlying, given that
Yes.
assumption, I can see how you get to the other one.
Yes.
But it seems to me there should be a lot of room in the policy area to revise our thinking and action.
It's not hard at all, sir, except that I've not run into a politician except for Mr. Kucinich on the left and Mr. Paul on the right, who say that intervention is not in the interests of the United States. We have our elite. There's no difference in our governing elite except in maybe in terms of harshness or softness of rhetoric, in terms of policy. No one in 35 years has moved us toward energy self-sufficiency or even any marked degree of improvement in that regard. No one can get elected if they question the relationship with the Israelis. No one is going to question the relationship with the dictatorship and tyranny that runs Saudi Arabia because we're dependent on them for oil and because they own a large portion of our debt. The point I tried to make in my books, is that if you don't change policy, you therefore have the option of, if you have to defend America, the only thing you have left is force.
Agreed. I think there's a lot of room in between.
Well, what seems reasonable to me, but I'm, often described as a psychopath because I think perhaps our relationship with Israel is not very important, or because we perhaps should be drilling in the Arctic or off the coast of California. My goal in all the things I've written have been to try to provoke that debate. This is a war that's ours only to the extent we let it be. Well, you're very kind, sir.
Thanks for speaking today, Michael. Chip Leitner. What would you say, given your just spoken views, that recent advances, like for instance today, this very day, in Kahar in the Barjur region, the Taliban announced a ceasefire because they've been getting their butts kicked. That's the bottom line, as I understand it. I think that's pretty accurate. You may be able to correct me there. And our recent and continued drone strikes into Pakistan, which we're obviously doing and not going to stop or acting really too bad about it. I think these things, from the outside attack, contend to show that we're making a little ground here and there. And what does this mean? Does it mean that any guy that rolls the dice enough is going to get lucky once in a while? Is that your opinion? Or do you think that there's an advantage in this?
I think in the Bajur business, there's a ceasefire there because the Taliban just won in Swat, which is the adjacent area. And what we're seeing is Zardari, who is the president of Pakistan, coming to a modus vivendi with all of these people in the border areas, because he cannot hold the country together and fight these people at the same time. So the idea that the ceasefire came because they were getting beat, I think I'm not there. It may be true, but I doubt it. I think what's happened there is the military and Zardari has said, listen, if Pakistan is going to remain a political entity, we can no longer have this fighting going on in our country because it's coming east. The Pakistanis, for the first time in their history, are now defending Peshawar, of all places, against their own tribes. So what I think we're seeing, the Taliban, ceasefire, we're getting beat. They're glad to say that if that's what Zardari needs. But the reality is they'll control the ground, just like in Swat. The second question, sir?
Well, I just wondered.
Oh, the drones.
It's sort of two problems.
The drones goes back to the usefulness of military action. From May of 2002 till I resigned from the agency in 2004 in November, we shot 4 missiles from the Predator because that's all the lawyers would let us shoot. Apparently, President Bush, before he left, took off the shackles of legalism, and now they're shooting more often. And I think the basic fact is people who are getting shot at, whether strafed, bombed, or whatever, make mistakes. They talk on the phone without encrypting it. They travel in convoys that are too big. They display mistakes. And so the more you shoot, the more it's a callous thing to say, but there's nothing that creates effective intelligence collection like violence. And I think that's what we're seeing.
Thank you.
Sir.
Yeah, I think you said about this is the war against the insurgency. I am from North Africa, and the French led this kind of war in Algeria, in Tunisia, in Morocco, without any tangible result.
Yes, sir.
So I think the problem is a political problem rather than a military or security issue. The problem is through this book you try to demonize 1 billion Muslims through the war.
I tried to demonize?
Yeah, I think.
Have you read the books?
Yeah, and
You should read it again.
A kind of enemy. What I think is the problem is with your foreign policy rather than with this region. You inaugurate since 1953 a series of coup d'etat in the Middle East, Iran. You are supporting the authoritarian regimes, dictatorship in this region, and the problem is more with the U.S. foreign policy than with Islam or.
That's exactly the point of my book, sir. I think you need to read it again. My point is exactly that one of the reasons we're so detested in the Middle East is because we sing the song of democracy and support Mubarak. The one reason I don't think the French example is a very good one is because the French wanted to stay there. There's no reason that we need to stay anywhere. What we need to do is destroy our enemies and let this basically intra-civilizational problem in Islam sort itself out. I'm not at all trying to demonize Muslims. I make a very strong argument that those people that say that there is Islamo-fascists and that all Muslims want to destroy our civilization are just idiots. So I don't think I'm demonizing anyone, except maybe American policymakers. Sir.
As a retired Army intelligence officer, I read your 2 last books, Through Our Enemy's Eyes and Marching Through Hell. And I'd like to say the specifics that you gave on Alex Station in describing philosophies and individuals was absolutely outstanding. I would strongly encourage anybody to read those books. weapons.
You're very kind, sir. Thank you.
My question has to do specifically with nuclear weapons.
Yes, sir.
As you know, it was leaked in December that Israel had approached the Bush administration about getting bunker busters and overflight permission to hit the plutonium enrichment factory that is supposedly being built in Iran.
Yes, sir.
Also, as of last Friday, it was noted on a television show that one analyst, Middle East analyst, said that Pakistan may have as many as 100 nuclear bombs, which I think is just, I didn't realize it was that great a number. My question is this. We have several Islamic terrorist groups in the Middle East. Are these weapons in Pakistan safe, realistically? And second of all, what are we going to do about the centrifuges and the plutonium enrichment in Iran? And I'm talking about not a political answer. I'm talking about something more dramatic and realistic.
I think let me take Pakistan first. I, for my sins, worked with the Pakistani military and ISI for most of my career, and I have tremendous respect for their capabilities. I believe at this point that the danger from Pakistan is less a leakage of bombs than a leakage of know-how from the civilian sector of the Pakistani atomic industry. I think right now those weapons are probably safe. If Pakistan implodes, then all bets are off. So that's one of the things that President Obama has to think about. In terms of Iran, you know, even if Iran had a nuclear weapon, what would they do with it regarding us? I don't think they're stupid people. They know they could be squashed very easily by the United States in terms of nuclear force. The Israelis could do the same thing to them. If we were really serious about non-proliferation, we would have done something about the French and the Germans when they sold all that equipment to the Iranians in the 1990s. I think that horse is out of the barn, but I think that Iran, next to Iraq, is the most containable country in the world. They're surrounded by Sunnis who'd rather kill them than look at them. Their energy industry was peaking, although now with the ability to work with Shias in Iraq, that's a different story. And frankly, their military is a third-rate organization.
May I follow up, though?
Yes, sir.
Your comment about the Sunnis and the Shias between Iran and Iraq and the obvious 8-year war that they had when Hussein was in charge. What do you think Iran is really after in relationship to Iraq by sending all these weapons in and basically prolonging our problems and everybody else's problems there? What do they want with Iraq? Do they want to take over the country, or what?
I don't think they could. We have Iraqis, I think, as specialists in the room. I would think that they want to be able to work with a Shia government in Iraq. I don't think they have any idea that they're going to somehow run the show there. Why are they supporting them? They're supporting them because they're Shia. They're supporting them because they're bleeding the Americans. I think it'd be foolish for us to think that we were going to go into Iraq and that the Iranian Shias weren't going to support their co-religionists.
One more follow-up. I'm sorry, this I'll shout. In relationship to Iraq, we're pulling out within a period of time. Who knows how much time? But what I'd like to get at is, we've been there almost 8 years now, and they can't defend themselves. I mean, you reach a point where if you want freedom, if you want this, if you want that, you stand up and defend it. Okay? To me, it seems like Iraq is going to fall eventually once we get out. Do you feel it's going to turn politically into another Muslim Islamic state similar to Iran?
I wouldn't think so, but I don't think we're leaving. I think the Israelis are going to prevent us from leaving. If we leave, Israel is done like dinner. Our greatest ally, and Israel's greatest ally, was Saddam Hussein. As long as he was in power, he was the cork in the neck of the bottle. The jihadis, the Sunni jihadis, were not coming from South Asia to the Levant, to Turkey, to the Arabian Peninsula, to North Africa, to Europe. By taking out Saddam, what we did was build a very nice westward highway for the jihadis. And so I think at the end of the day, before long, you'll be hearing Obama come up with reasons why we can't leave as quickly as we could, why we have to stay a little bit longer. But I don't think it's going to work. I think we're not being attacked now. The awakening had some impact there, but a lot of those people simply left the country to come back at a later time. But they're not attacking us now because they think we're going. If we don't go, both sides will begin to attack us again. I think we have a real hostage to fortune. I don't think we're going to leave Iraq anytime soon in any great numbers, sir. Because then the flow of jihadis toward the Levant, there's nothing to stop them. In fact, the Shia government would push them that way.
The one country that you haven't talked at all about is Syria.
Well, I've always, when I was a youngster, which was a long time ago during the '67 war, Syria began to be painted as a threat to the United States. And frankly, I was stupid enough to believe they were until the last 15 years. And you look on a map, and here's the United States of America, big continental power, and here's Syria. It's kind of, is it really a country, or is it kind of an ink blob on the map? How could Syria possibly be a threat to the United States? The other point I would make is the older Assad made a deal with the devil. Like Sadat, like the Pakistanis, they tried to buy off the Islamists, and ultimately that will come home to roost there. They're going to have a problem just like Jordan has, just like Pakistan, just like Egypt. But again, it's a stretch for me to see Syria as a threat to the United States. Sir?
To what extent does or should some sort of like peace that the U.S. could have a role in the ongoing Israeli-Palestine conflict, or however you want to frame that, to what extent is that an interest of ours, and should it be?
Yeah, I don't think it's an interest at all. I don't think America's interest would suffer if Israel and Palestine both disappeared tomorrow. What difference would it make to us in North America? The founders were very clear that we shouldn't become involved in other people's wars. And if that needed any proof, look at Israel and Palestine. And in truth, how can anybody in their right mind think that we are going to be viewed by anyone as an honest broker here? Obama was absolutely silent, which was a very eloquent statement to the people who think we're not going to be fair during the Gaza invasion. And I'm one that thinks Israel should do whatever it needs to do to survive. I'm not saying that the Israelis are bad or the Palestinians are good. I'm just saying both of them are irrelevant to the true national interests of the United States. Sir?
Okay, I have two questions. First one, are you familiar with the Rashad Khalifa assassination? He was an imam in Tucson and was stabbed 19 times in 1990.
I remember the case, sir, but I'm not...
Could you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, it was a question about an imam in Tucson that was stabbed 19 times. Was that Fukra organization that killed him?
I was just wondering, because he had that, what he did was he published this Quran that was numerology that reduced...
Yes. What I remember about that, there was a black American Muslim group, that was associated with some Pakistani Islamists.
That's not Al-Qaeda.
No, it was called Jamaat al-Fukra, which I think means the party of the oppressed or something like that. And as I recall from FBI reporting, they were accused of killing that imam, but I'm not sure.
I was just wondering whether you ever studied the numerology, like Bin Laden usually allegedly has some numerology, and the number 19 with that continues to figure in as the Quran says regarding the power 19, number 19 hijackers, all these numbers. Did you ever look at?
I never did, sir. And on the 19 for the hijackers, it was only 19 because a couple of them couldn't get in. The intent was to have a couple more than 19.
Okay, and then my other question is 9/11 truthers. What do you think of them?
I think everybody has their own point of view and they have the right to it.
I think it was information warfare. Right after 9/11, the 9/11 truthers were on the internet all over the place saying that Satan was seen in a cloud of smoke.
I think that it was such a stunning, unexpected event that it lent itself to conspiracy thinking. And of course, Americans are not immune from, over the course of our history, from conspiracy thinking. But I think the evidence is overwhelming that it was Al-Qaeda who did it. You know, we captured information as early as 1995 from their computers that showed that they were thinking about using 747s to drive into CIA headquarters, which was a disturbing discovery. So I don't know of any evidence that I've read by the truthers that would convince me that they have a substantial argument, but being also a CIA officer, I never say never. Ma'am.
Are there any specific changes, well, structural changes to the intelligence community that you would see as beneficial in regards to the way it shapes foreign policy?
I think what's important in the intelligence community would be first to destroy what they've done since 9/11. Because what they've created, instead of 16 organizations, we now have 17. And the Director of National Intelligence is sucking the best and brightest from all the other components. The next thing is for the Congress and the government under either party to stop talking about the necessity of complete intermeshing of activities by the intelligence community. None of the components of the intelligence community have the same statutory authority. The FBI and other components have no authority to break the law, either at home or abroad. The CIA has no authority to break it at home. We have carte blanche to break it overseas. So the idea that you can ever get to the point where 16 components are all working together is nonsense. And it sounds good when the congressmen say it or when the president says it, but in reality they'd have to rewrite virtually every statute that created every one of the agencies. I think one thing that would help intelligence is for the President of the United States to kill people when they need to be killed before it becomes a bigger problem. The world we live in today is not the Cold War world. And although President Bush gave preemption a bad name, preemption in terms not of all-out military invasions, but taking out people when they are in the formative stages is going to be very important for the security of the United States. The one thing that can't be helped, and one thing I saw over the course of 5 administrations, was the election of people who see the world as they want to see it and not how it is. And there's an increase. When I left in '04, maybe it's much better than it was now. Maybe it's much better now than it was then. There was a certain amount of a wall that you could not penetrate because they didn't want to hear it. For example, the 2 examples that have always struck me as the outstanding examples, no administration that I worked under, Democratic or Republican, wanted to hear anything negative about Saudi Arabia or Israel. And if the agency, and I'm very specific just for the CIA, if the agency didn't want to do something one of those countries did, they circumvented the agency, went right to the White House, and we were ordered to do it. So we have, it's just, I said to Dr. Drake, there's a certain Jacobinism in American politicians. They think the world is their definition of the world. So I think that has to change, or intelligence is useless no matter how good it is. Sir.
Do you feel that our pursuit of bin Laden on a covert or overt basis is worthwhile? And could you comment on our efforts with passage of time, particularly in light of books like Marcus Luttrell's Sole Survivor and Dalton Fury, Killed bin Laden?
Well, I think Dalton Fury's book is eloquent about the fact that until recently, most of our generals were just civil servants. When you read Fury's book and they describe what those men would had tried to do to go to get bin Laden, when there were divisions of American Marines and soldiers there to do that job, it speaks eloquently about the risk aversion, I think, of at least the generals who came out of the Cold War period. I shouldn't have got off on that, sir. Oh, the worth of getting bin Laden. Bin Laden is truly a great man in the sense of Hitler on the cover of Time magazine in 1938. There's no one who's affected the way Americans live more than he has in the last 50 years. the way we think about domestic security, the way we look at our government. Are they spying on us? Are they profiling us? The way we look at our neighbors. Is the Muslim next door going to blow up my kid's school? He has had an enormous effect. Whoever thought in America that a grammar school class would have to go through a magnetometer to go to an art museum? So I think from that perspective, he deserves to be dead. He is also an odd combination of an 8th century theologian and a 21st century CEO. When you read the story of how 9/11 was conducted, he set the parameters and then delegated the responsibility to his lieutenants on the ground.
I happened to watch Investigation Discovery last night, the 2 hours, and you were on there.
Oh, was it?
You were on there, and I was going to follow up as far as Richard Clark, the tremendous frustration he had in trying to bring this action to the attention of people, make it action.
Well, I have to say that Mr. Clark was at the center of this, and the CIA presented to the president 8 chances to kill bin Laden and 2 to capture him, and they always found reasons not to. And I have to tell you quite frankly, when I ran those operations, it was much easier. Bin Laden had a learning curve for personal security. When we were following him in 98 and 99, I said at lunch today, he was a little bit like a blue-collar guy. He would grab his lunch bucket at 8, drive in from his farm to Kandahar, hang around with the guys, and then come back. So he was predictable. But especially after the coal, they expected us to respond dramatically with military force after they almost sunk our ship. And so after that, when we didn't attack, they were surprised, but their security got much better. I think he very much deserves to be killed, and it would benefit us. But really, what really killed us was the war in Iraq. The invasion of Iraq was kind of the fulfillment of everything he said the Americans were going to do. But more important, it was almost the perfect predicate for a jihad according to the Quran. An infidel power invading a Muslim country without provocation, occupying it, and installing man-made laws, parliaments, and constitutions rather than God's law. It is almost a perfect predicate, and we're going to have to live with that for a long time.
Do you know the target involved in Marcus Luttrell's SEAL team action? Was it bin Laden, or are you able to say?
I don't know the answer to that, sir. Next. Sir.
Yeah, just a couple quick ones here. I've come across a lot of references, some documentation, the fact that a few months before 9/11, a CIA agent and other political figures in the West made a call on Osama bin Laden, who was in a hospital in Saudi Arabia. I have no way of knowing if that's true or not. Just wondering if you heard anything about that, and what were they doing if it actually happened?
Sir, I was in a position to know, but the one thing a CIA officer is very confident of, that even the things he should know, sometimes he doesn't know because they're kept from him. But I have to say, I never heard of anything like that. At that time, it would have been possible for him to go back to Saudi Arabia, because the Saudis don't care what he does outside of the peninsula. It wasn't until 2003 that they really cared about al-Qaeda at all when he attacked in Riyadh. So it's possible, but I never heard even a whisper of it, and I think I would have. And I'm not sure he would talk to anybody from the West in any event. Sir. Oh, I'm sorry, you had a second question, sir. No?
That's okay. Well,
there's also a story.
You didn't hear about, because there were a lot of references floating around. I mean, Michael Moore's Fahrenheit 9/11.
Yeah.
You can dismiss or not. Loosechange.com has some very interesting.
There was also a story that I believe the Kuwaitis were supposed to have let him into Kuwait to get dialysis treatment a couple of weeks before 9/11.
Yeah, something to do with kidney problems.
Yeah,
All
yeah.
that Afghan water.
All that Afghan water.
There was another thing, too, where he was quoted as saying after 9/11 that he was very flattered. He put out some sort of announcement. He was very flattered that everybody thought it was him, but it wasn't. That was his quote.
Yeah. It wasn't until a year later that they accepted responsibility for it. And if if you're a kind of a pedantic character like me, if you read their doctrine is never to accept credit for something at the height of the other guy's propaganda. Wait till the propaganda of the enemy goes away and then make your claim. So by 9/11/2002, we had peaked in our propaganda, and then they came out with their admission of responsibility. It's very clear, though, so the evidence is really overwhelming. I don't know what the truth tellers have to say, but in terms of intelligence, I don't know if it'll hold up in court, but in terms of intelligence information, it's overwhelmingly in favor of concluding that Al-Qaeda did 9/11. Sir.
I'm Rob Cheney from Missouri. What's the end game of savagery? I mean, even Sherman, after he marched through the South, we had to put it in an occupation government.
Well, because that was our country. If we're savage overseas and we have no interest there except defeating the enemy, we can come back home. The idea is to go, win, and get out, not go, win, and stay.
But you said earlier that our concern with Al-Qaeda, or Al-Qaeda's concern with us, is that we're supporting governments they don't like.
Right.
So if the governments become governments they like, is that in our favor?
I don't think it's in our disfavor. You know, bin Laden says, what am I going to do with oil? Drink it? It's going to be at a higher price if I take over. But certainly an Islamist government run by bin Laden couldn't be any more dictator-like or tyrannical than the Saudi government. Probably would be less, certainly less than Mubarak's government. But the reaction is we can't tolerate it for reasons that probably have more to do with our fear of change than with reality. Sir.
I don't know which book it was in, but you wrote once that you're not a big fan of coincidences.
Sir.
We haven't had a huge attack on this country since 9/11/01. I'm not an apologist for Cheney, but Cheney makes the point that has not been an accident or a coincidence. Given all that,
yeah.
Do you believe it's just a matter of patience, they're just being patient, or has our right-wing regime been more effective than we want to believe?
Well, there was no attack on the United States for 50 years before 9/11, so I think we're perfectly equipped now to stop an Al-Qaeda attack if a certifiably lunatic Al-Qaeda guy tries to bring a bomb across at Windsor, Detroit, or through the official crossing point at Juarez. Otherwise, no.
But if he's not a lunatic, then we're not equipped.
We're done. And I really believe that the reason there hasn't been an attack so far is for two reasons. First, one of the few places where Al-Qaeda has put itself in a box is that they've promised each attack would be incrementally larger than the last one. And if you chart the attacks from 92 to 2001, they have been, not in a straight line, but they have been more damaging, each one, than the last. The second thing is I tend to believe they can't believe how much good fortune they've had since 9/11. You know, if you go back to the three things I mentioned, bleed us to bankruptcy, spread out our intelligence and our military forces to the point of inflexibility, and creating dissension at home, they would have had to be pretty happy with the results. I think that's changing because the opportunity that they're afforded now because of the economic problems we're going through, if they can add to that, that really pushes. We very often dismiss their war aims as if they were going to do all of these things by themselves. Spread out our military forces to the point where they break, bankrupt us. And that's not at all the case. If you read what they've said, they want to attack us to do those things, but they also talk quite frequently about taking advantage of serendipitous developments that they don't have a hand in, like the war in Iraq. I would think that the kind of economic problem we have now is something that's very tempting. Ma'am.
If we're to think about the CIA as a service agency, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how sharp the tool is right now. You mentioned your concern about, thinning out intelligence resources? Has that affected the CIA?
The tool is not very sharp, ma'am. It never has been very sharp against this target. Another thing we were talking about at lunch was when the Cold War developed, the Congress passed an act, I think it was called the National Defense Education Act. And taxpayer money went to support institutes that studied the Soviet Union. Everything from intercontinental missiles to the potato crop in the Ukraine. We had it cold, and we had redundant human manpower. We could hive off 100 people to do a special project on the Soviet Union and never miss them. We have not done the same thing on Islam. Although it was recommended by the 9/11 Commission, they haven't done it because they don't know how to do it. If the National Defense Funding or Education Act was created because we identified the Soviet Union as an enemy. If we do the same thing for the Islamists, it's politically incorrect to say that Islam is the enemy, so as the result, we've done nothing. We have very few experts on this particular topic, although because of the wars, that number is growing by force of circumstance. But I don't think there's a deliberate effort at all within the United States government to create a cadre to look at this problem in the same way we did to look at the Soviet problem.
This is the National Security Education Program.
Well, it's now?
Yeah.
Well, it's still not producing very many people. I read in, at least in 2005, we produced 3 PhDs in Islamic studies, one in architecture, one in art, and one in poetry, which is fine.
There's also the American Institute for Afghan Studies, John Mitchell's program.
In Nebraska.
I think he's was somewhere in the East Coast. He's
Oh.
a big university think tank kind of thing that it's.
Yes, but the problem with that, and there's another one at Omaha in Nebraska, very good guy, I can't remember his name, but he was a Peace Corps guy in Afghanistan in the 70s. The problem is, those centers don't look at those countries as enemies. They look at them as, you know, we need to learn about their culture and we need to learn, all that stuff is fine, but it doesn't really move you in the direction of defending yourself, at least in the short term.
Beverly Eckert recently died in a plane crash in Buffalo.
Yes.
New York. And she was a 9/11 truth activist. And she had a list of questions for various officials that were never answered, though she repeatedly asked them. And I just want to know what the government stands to gain in withholding information from the people.
You want my opinion on that?
Why they're doing that?
You want my opinion on that? The Congress, the 9/11 Commission, and the executive never allowed anyone who actually worked on the target, against the target, on a day-to-day basis to talk to the American people. No one who testified on television really knew what they were talking about. Because there's so much blame to go around under both parties that I think the 9/11 Commission decided, you know, the American people would be so disenchanted with the way their parties ran their government that we don't want to tell the truth. I think if the archive of the 9/11 Commission is ever released in an unredacted manner, if the testimony that was provided by not only myself but dozens of officers under oath and complemented by documents, if that ever comes out, I think the American people will be shocked by the dereliction of their government and the refusal to take risks to defend Americans. I think the 9/11 survivors are exactly right to be pushing, but I think they're pushing for, they're not going to find at the end of the rainbow what they think they're going to find. It's not a conspiracy to hide, you know, an attack by CIA and Mossad or by some other wacky organization. What it's designed to do is to hide the culpability of government officials.
But it can't be denied that we've gained thousands in industry, but I mean, millions and billions of dollars through our efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan. One of your questions was, Dick Cheney, to please discuss the advice and plans of the Energy Advisory Council, specifically as they related to pipeline development and gas oil exploration in Afghanistan and Iraq and other Middle Eastern countries, and the feasibility of such development or exploration prior to 9/11.
You know, I can't answer that. I don't think it's an unreasonable request, but I think they decided that was executive privilege, didn't they? I can tell you, though, in '95, one of the reasons we couldn't deal with the Taliban more aggressively was because President Clinton's administration was pushing Unocal to win a contract to run a gas pipeline from Turkmenistan through Kandahar to Karachi. So when I said earlier that there's many things that come first before protecting Americans, one of them is oil and gas deals. Another one is selling guns to Arabs. Another one is they hate to be criticized by the Europeans. Even the Bush administration. We had under our sights Zarqawi every day almost for a year before the invasion of Iraq. And they didn't kill him because they wanted to try to wine and dine the French and Germans to come along with us to Iraq. And so now in the absolutely absurd position of Zarqawi probably being responsible for more dead Americans in 2 years than Saddam's military was in 2 wars. So, you know, there's lots of these things that never get out into the public, but it's more dereliction of duty than it is evil planning, I think. Sir.
Michael, 2 of your predecessors in the President's Lecture Series were John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt. I wonder if you'd give us your analysis of the worth of their book on the Israel lobby.
Well, I think it's a very worthwhile book. In fact, when I reviewed it on the internet and I suggested they move on to the Saudi lobby, which I think is just as dangerous and just as detrimental to the United States. But to imagine that there isn't an Israeli lobby and it isn't overwhelmingly influential on the conduct of American policy in the Middle East is to be next to an idiot. Look at the conference of IPAC every year. Virtually every congressman and senator goes up and genuflects and takes donations for his campaign fund. More people go to that. The VFW couldn't get that number of people to come and praise American veterans. My own view is, and what I tried to write in Marching Toward Hell, was the problem is not Israel. The problem is some Jewish American citizens who seem more interested in protecting the Israelis than in protecting the United States. And I think Mearsheimer and Walt did a very credible job in putting that information out before the public. And you can deny it, but it's there. In my own experience, as I said earlier, if the Israelis want something and the agency won't cooperate, they can go right to the White House and it gets done immediately, no matter who's in power. And now we have Rahm Emanuel, the chief of staff of the President of the United States, who served in the Israeli Defense Forces. I wouldn't want to be the CIA officer going in to give the President our most sensitive information every morning with him sitting there. So I think it's bad for America, and I think it's most bad for America because it is a distortion of the Second Amendment, or the First Amendment. If people talk about it, they're hounded, like Walt and Mearsheimer. Walt and Mearsheimer wrote a very important book. 60 Minutes wouldn't touch it. Not because it wasn't a good book, but because they were afraid of what the lobby would do to CBS. Sir.
Yes. If you could step outside of your student shoes for a moment.
I've done that 5 years ago, sir, almost.
But I don't think it's affected your general outlook.
Maybe, sir.
On the agency. I'm thinking about some of the remarks that you made here today relative to the costs of the Iraqi misadventure. And as far as I can tell, it all had to do with the cost to the United States, to the Treasury, to the soldiers, Marines who were unfortunately involved in that war. And I'd like to hear from, I think, one of your questioners that in your book you do mention the fact that some of the costs, or at least a major
government didn't cost what to the Iraqi people and their land. Is that true?
No, it's not, sir. No.
Well, now, how can you explain that? How can you avoid not mentioning?
I think the only thing worse than the Iraq War was going to war and not winning. I'm not one that cares much about foreigners at all, sir, but...
That's an extremely cold-blooded...
Absolutely, sir. Foreign policy is about interest. It's not about morality.
I've never heard anybody express it. I mean, I thank you for expressing the fact openly.
Yeah.
That's as cold-blooded a view as...
Well, I think war should be the last resort.
People don't matter.
They don't matter to me, sir.
Perhaps a million dead.
Whatever it takes for us to win.
Destroyed, and you don't think that is worth mentioning?
Oh, I think it's worth mentioning, but I don't think it's worth crying about. The only thing worse than going to war is not winning. And we managed to have both a war we should never have fought and a war eventually we're going to be seen to have lost in Iraq.
How can you speak about winning a war where you have to go in and destroy more people?
Well, sir, we're the boys that brought you the firebombing at Tokyo. And we don't have a problem with the Japanese anymore.
It's not a problem, but there are a lot of Japanese that still remember what happened.
Yeah, and there's 500,000 Marines and soldiers that didn't die when we didn't invade Japan.
Inexcusable for you to omit.
Well, sir, I look for my excuses from the Almighty,
You
sir.
have the right to your opinion, as you said we did. as
Yes,
well.
sir.
But I think it would be probably fruitless for me to ask you to step out of your shoes and to contemplate what is it about the American character that permits that to happen to a people that they have this to, and then not even agonize about it.
Well,
you don't seem to agonize at all. Is there any...
I agonize for my country, sir.
I must say that Ray McGovern is also a former colleague of yours in the CIA. Well, when he speaks about Iraq, he speaks in an entirely different...
Absolutely, he does. He's a...
And he gives a full human picture.
Well, I try to give a full American picture. I frankly don't give a damn what it takes to defend the United States.
Excuse me, this is exactly what the Nazis would say.
I don't think that's right, sir.
No, that's absolutely
I don't think so.
That's all that mattered was the Nazis, the Germans.
If, America should only wage war in self-defense.
Hell with everyone else.
Oh, sir, come on. What did we do to Dresden? What did we do to Berlin?
Terrible. That was terrible.
It was not terrible.
It was terrible.
We rid the world of Nazism.
What's that?
We rid the world of Nazism. We, of all people, the Red Army.
Well, there's still a few Nazis around. There are neo-Nazis. The world.
Well, I don't think the Wehrmacht is going to show up in Paris, although it might in Paris.
For a commentator who was invited to the University of Montana campus to comment on a very important issue, to be completely devoid of any human feeling, I feel is inexcusable. And I've said my piece.
Well, then I'll leave early today, sir, if that's what you'd like. It's the thing about freedom of speech is it's a rough, rocky road. And if you don't like it, you don't like it, but you'll get over it. Sir, let me go to this other gentleman first, sir.
Recently, I heard Richard Holbrooke say that we now have Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India with the same enemy. Speaking to the fact that maybe those three governments would cooperate in some way or another. Does that seem at all logical and reasonable?
If you think it does, sir, I have a bridge that I could sell you. No, sir, it's not possible. Mr. Holbrooke is going to have the same success he had in the Balkans, maybe. He can get a timeout so everybody can rearm. Then when we leave, the war starts again. But the Indians and Paks, they're oil and water. And one of the problems we have with India at the moment, with Pakistan, is that we have created in Afghanistan a government that's very India-friendly. India has greatly expanded its presence in Afghanistan. And the Pakistanis have always regarded India-free Afghanistan as their strategic depth. Now they think the Indians are on both sides of them. If anything, it's raised the prospect of war between Pakistan and India. So, again, I think Mr. Holbrooke is doing what most of our big-name diplomats do, and that's blow smoke. The Indians are in the catbird seat because they're on both sides of the packs right now. And until that changes, we're not going to get much cooperation from the Pakistanis regarding Afghanistan.
Just a quick follow-up. You mentioned a couple times this afternoon to go, win, and leave. But that leaves a vacuum at the end. I mean,
you can always go back, sir.
How do you deal with that?
You might have to go back a second, third, or fourth time, but as long as you're going back to destroy and leave, then what's the difference? That's what the military's for. If you stay in Afghanistan, you may as well stay until you can make it the 51st state, because otherwise there's no way to fix it. That's the problem we have, sir. That's absolutely the case. You don't know what's coming down the road, but you know what the problem is at the moment. And I think you can't expect any politician to be a demigod. He can fix the things that are on his watch, and if he doesn't fix them, they get worse as time goes by. So I always think it's better to take the bird in the hand than to try to plan something bigger later on. Let me get somebody. Sir.
I'm one of those Muslims that was born overseas that will probably be just collateral damage, not the way that you're thinking. It's kind of unfortunate because having been born overseas and lived most of my life overseas, I viewed American foreign policy differently. The initial American policy was very favorable to the Third World, and most of the Muslim country at that time was the Third World.
Absolutely.
They engaged in trying to better the countries economically, with education, with healthcare, with all kinds of things. Those countries at that time were more concerned about their national priorities. Islam was never even mentioned.
Right.
Religion has only become a feature since, I would say, after the oil embargo.
I think that's right.
Continuously becoming so. Before that, the Muslim world and America were never at odds.
Well, we went to the rescue over Suez.
Suez was a problem. Israel has always been an issue.
Yes.
And I think the lack of a peace process, a meaningful peace process being pushed, has been seen as the Muslim world, by the Muslim world, as a big thorn in the side and a big recruiting tool. And I think the Muslim world, even though the Americans see it as a unified world, is anything but unified.
Exactly.
I mean, there's 1.2 billion people out there in the Muslim world, and every one of them is at each other's throats. So, but if there's any one thing that brings them into unity, it is the Israeli-Palestinian issue,
yes,
and now the Iraq issue.
Yes.
I mean, in the 1980 war, you know, probably not one American life was killed, while, you know, tens of thousands of Muslims died, while Iraq and Iran went at each other's throats. And the jury is still out as to who instigated that and who ordered or who gave the green light to Saddam to go in. Meanwhile, America profited tremendously by supplying weapons to both sides. It hates both sides. It publicly hated Saddam. It publicly hated Iran, yet was perfectly happy to fuel both sides.
Absolutely.
If they saw one side winning, they would supply arms to the other side, and vice versa. So as long as each one of them was killing the other, they were perfectly content. Now, it's like things have changed. So the Muslim world is totally confused as to what American foreign policy really is all about. Is it about oil? Is it about protecting Israel? I mean, you said that you don't really care about what happens other than to Americans. I mean, that's almost just the same way as Bin Laden saying, I don't really care what happens other than to my people. You know, they're busily killing more Muslims than you guys are.
Well, I think that's the case certainly to some extent in Iraq, but otherwise it's not. And I agree with almost everything you say, and that's why I think we should disengage from the Middle East to the extent we can, as quickly as we can, and let the Muslim world sort out its own problems. And I wish the Muslim world was confused about our foreign policy. I don't think it is. I think one of the things that across the spectrum, they regard our foreign policy as anti-Muslim.
I think if you disengage, you mean America disengaged from the Middle East. You have to include Israel as a Middle East.
Absolutely.
And if you disengage from there, Israel is going to be wiped out. They might have nuclear weapons, but that's been the biggest stumbling block is that, okay, Pakistan gets nuclear weapons, and there's calls for boycott and economic
Yes.
sanctions, yet Pakistan is creating nuclear weapons because India was allowed to.
Yes.
And their battle is not, Pakistan's battle is not with America, but it's with India.
I entirely
Iran
agree.
is trying to create nuclear weapons. Half the Muslim countries are. Libya was because Israel has them.
Yes.
And yet there's no sanctions placed on Israel. No mention is even made about Israel. Why? Because they didn't sign the non-proliferation, so that gives them the right to have nuclear weapons, but not its regional
No, it's because they
competitors.
corrupted the American political system.
Well,
And the Saudis.
I applaud you for saying that, because if I said that, I would be considered anti-Jewish.
And the most important thing, you know, to me that you've said, in which so many people in our country, especially influential people, don't say, is that Islamic civilization is as diverse and fractured as any other great civilization, between languages and dialects and sects and geographic disparities. There is no great green wave coming our way. All it is an attempt to avoid discussing these issues of policy. It is to try to convince the American people that somehow this thing they call Islamofascism, which only exists among our allies, like the Saudis and the Egyptians, is a threat to the United States, and it's not. So, you know, you and I don't disagree that much. And my unconcern with foreign casualties is only to the extent that America needs to defend itself. And I think in Afghanistan we're clearly defending ourselves, or we should have been defending ourselves against a very small part of the Muslim world, which was Al-Qaeda, and to the extent that we needed to destroy the Taliban, that was it. We had no problems in Iraq. Iraq was eminently containable. Well, that's one thing that this afternoon you can't blame on me. We're defending the status quo. This country is a country born of revolution. We are completely unwilling to tolerate any kind of change in a system that favors us. For all of Obama's talk, they're not going to change anything. That we're more afraid of change than we are of anything else. If we can't predict what's going to come, we're not going to go there. But it's coming anyway. The reality is that the world is going to change. I think the reality on the Israeli-Palestinian thing is we waited too long. The smart Israeli leaders are dead. The Israelis killed many of the Palestinian leaders that might have made a peace with them, and now the Hamases and the Zealots are really taking over that movement, I think. Time doesn't work in your favor sometimes. Sir.
I've been struck by how compatible your conservative positions are with a reasonable liberal position, except when you insist that you don't care about people in the rest of the world. And I'd just like to suggest that you've got a lot to say to liberal audiences, and you might be able to think your way through to a softer position. And that would make life more rich for you.
My frame of reference here is wartime. And, you know, I don't think America should kill anybody that doesn't threaten us or attack us. But once that happens, what you want to do in the interest of humanity is to end the war that needs to be fought as quickly as you can, and not to drag it out. And the faster you smash the enemy, the faster the war stops. Machiavelli wrote it 500 years ago, sir. Use your best punch first.
When you're talking to liberal audiences, you're going to scare some of them away with that last aspect of your philosophy. Well, because I can accept the vast majority of what you have had to say, but then, as the objections from other members of the audience have suggested, there are some reservations I have about the moral side of your view.
Well, I guess the simplest way to say it is that in wartime, an American president who considers a foreign life of equal value to an American shouldn't be president. Sir.
Then let me add one different element to the question. Earlier this year, the magazine Physics Today did a...
Not one of my regular readings. I apologize for that.
Did a review of the possible consequences of limited nuclear exchange. And they concluded that a relatively limited exchange, for example, between India and Pakistan, of a very small number of nuclear warheads fired off, would have global environmental consequences, which is a direct threat to us if we include ourselves in the globe. Given that almost everybody, every nation that we've talked about in this discussion is nuclear armed, do we have a dog in that fight to somehow prevent a nuclear conflict amongst those people that we are not directly fighting?
Amongst Pakistan and India? Surely we did.
Or Iran, or Israel, or whoever else we listed that also has that.
But I guess my point would be is you have to assume that so many people are stupid if you think Iran is going to attack somebody with a nuclear weapon. They may talk stupid and very flamboyantly, but the Persians know that they get their clocks cleaned, that there wouldn't be a problem. If we were really concerned about Pakistan and India, for example, we would not have pushed and forced the Pakistanis to do what they've done in their own country and destabilize it. You know, we sometimes our display of knowledge at the senior government level is not particularly impressive. For example, we were pushing Musharraf to do our dirty work along his border, and he even sent his army into the border area for the first time in Pakistan's history, and it got beat. What did we do? When President Bush went out there for the first time, he went to India and signed a nuclear deal with the Indians. Now, what do you think that caused amongst the generals who are supporting Musharraf? We have to sort these things out, you know, what's important and what's not. You can't do everything at once. Frankly, our activities in South Asia have increased the chance of a war between Pakistan and India, not decreased it.
Very quickly, Mullah Omar has kind of disappeared, reappeared, disappeared.
Yeah.
There's been talk that there's friction between Ayman al-Zawahiri and bin Laden. Could you address the triad of those three, and if Omar is still in charge of the Taliban, et cetera?
Mullah Omar is certainly in the symbolic leadership of the Taliban. He's the spiritual leader. He clearly has some very potent military commanders under his authority, but who operate probably without direct day-to-day attention from Mullah Omar. I think that the West is longing for controversy between Zawahiri and bin Laden. All of the evidence is that Zawahiri has changed his thinking in bin Laden's direction, not the other way around. Zawahiri was always of the position that the road to Jerusalem went through Cairo first. He was a very, very nationalist oriented person. He only came to the U.S. as the #1 priority target, after he joined Al-Qaeda. I don't think Zawahiri would foment that kind of problem, because he's a respected figure, but he's not a loved figure. He's very avuncular, he's very sharp-edged, and being an Egyptian, he's very full of himself. You know, we've been here 4,000 years, we're the greatest Arab civilization, all of that. So Zawahiri he's important, but I don't think he's going to rock the boat. I think it's something that we look for in the West because we want it to happen. It's like these guys who are criticizing bin Laden from the bowels of Mubarak's prison. The Western journalists are saying, oh my goodness, that's a great sign. Well, in the Muslim world, the guy in prison is not listened to very often. And you know, Dr. Fadl, the guy in the Egyptian prison, got a toaster and a TV for writing what he did about Zawahiri. So I wouldn't look for that kind of problem to be fatal.
Michael, no one appears to have fallen asleep in this room. I think we've taxed you as far as we can. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, sir.